Hello and welcome to tonight's Commonwealth Club World Affairs program. I'm DJ Patil, general partner at Great Point Ventures and former U.S. chief data scientist and member of the Commonwealth Club World Affairs Board of Governors. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce Kanwal Rekhi. Kanwal was the first Indo-American founder and CEO to take a venture-backed public company public on the NASDAQ. He has also notably co-founded TIE, the Indus Entrepreneurs, the largest global network of Indian entrepreneurs, and also co-founded Aventis. Kanwal came to the United States from India to pursue his graduate studies and rose through the engineering ranks at several technology companies. He co-founded Exelon in Silicon Valley to commercialize Ethernet and TCP/IP standards, which became the basis and backbone of the internet. Now, this is extra special for me on a few dimensions. First, people like Kanwal really paved the way for people like me. So we literally stand on the shoulders of giants like Kanwal. Second is I'm very fortunate to personally have gotten the advice and wisdom, whether I like it or not, from Kanwal, and more often than not through osmosis. And I've also had, third is I've had a great front row seat to watching him work, along with my father and others creating TIE. And it's one of the reasons I was so excited about his book, The Groundbreaker: Risks, Rewards, and Lessons from a Legendary Entrepreneur. So Kanwal, welcome back to the Commonwealth World Affairs Club.
Oh, thank you. It's my pleasure. It's my pleasure.
So, this was really a phenomenal read for so many dimensions, because also there was a lot of not only so much wisdom and nuggets in there, but also so much of your story. And one of the things I was very pleasantly surprised to learn about you is what an unremarkable student you were at IIT, especially given my academic past. And yet yours is a quintessential Silicon Valley story, starting literally with $8 in your pocket, a business plan and a napkin, to big-time CEO. So I don't want to give away the book, but maybe talk to us about that moment of arriving to the United States with $8 in your pocket.
So I was a late bloomer, as you mentioned. 60s, just to give you a perspective of 60s, America was at the top of its game. America was about to put a man on the moon, and it was still roughly about 40 to 45% of world's GDP, and India was at the bottom of its game. We had a famine in India in 1966. Very few people remember or recall that one. Where America was shipping millions of tons of wheat to India to keep Indians from starving. So that was the background, and people like us coming from IITs, we thought we were the best of the best, at least in our own minds. But there were no jobs for us in India. There were no jobs. You could get a job as a sales engineer, maybe a management trainee, but no design jobs.
These are like the government-style jobs.
Government-style jobs. You get at the bottom of the ladder, and maybe 10 years from now, you might do something. And here, we have a space background. Computer chips are happening. Computers are happening. And in America. And lucky for us, there was a change of law in 1965. The Hart-Celler Act of 1965. U.S. opened up the doors for us. Please come. If you're an engineer or scientist, you're welcome to America. So here we are. So the $8 is a little bit of more story and mythological. Then they allowed us to send some money ahead of time. And and also there was a little bit,
$8 doesn't take, whatever you send is not going to go far.
Not very far. But you are allowed to buy $8 at the airport in cash. If you had any more dollars in your pocket, nobody had to know.
So you get here, but also where you land and some of the jobs you take on are not what you would think of, I think, as traditional path to Silicon Valley. So what and the thing that sort of strikes me through the through line through some of the book is that you really have a chip on your shoulder. You had a chip on your shoulder growing up with your father. You have a chip on your shoulder as you kind of go through this through your first couple companies and jobs that you're there. And I'm curious mostly about where did that fire in your belly and that chip, where did that fire come from? Is it the chip? Is it something else that really motivated you?
Well, so I have a chip on the shoulder still, and I still have things to prove. But, my eldest brother was really smart, and handsome, and he went to National Defense Academy, like the West Point here, and became an officer. My elder brother Tony, he's probably here in the audience. Yeah, he's here in the audience. Tony went to Indian Military Academy and became an officer. And here I am, a person with a speech impairment, very outward fidget. Was weakling. I was a runt of and so my father was sort of almost ashamed of me. I mean, somebody visiting the house, they will say, "Why don't you disappear for 4 or 5 hours? Don't show up until these guys are done." Well, that kind of thing. So I grew up with that attitude, and I used to get mad, but there's not much you can do, right? And my father was an army officer too, and he would tell me, "Well, I don't know what's going to happen to you. I'm sorry, I can't help you much." And yes, maybe I'll contribute, some money towards one of those vendor things, so you could sell stuff on the street. So it was very sort of. He was pretty openly like that, and I would say I'll show it to him one of these days. That was it. But my mother, on the other hand, was very much sure that I was going to amount to something.
One of the two women you dedicate the book to.
Yeah. So my mother, so I'm getting this, two messages, right? You're nothing, and you're going to go places. Mm-hmm. And
Why did you listen to her?
It was more desirable.
Obviously, but it's like your father was a very powerful figure in the community. I mean, he's a leader, in the military. He has stature. You could easily over-index to listening to him, but you listened to your mom. And I asked that from a sense of what should people take away about who they listen to.
So all this time, people know me as a mentor now, but all this time I'm mentoring. People are coming to me for help with math. Almost all the neighborhood kids will come and with help with math. I taught everybody how to ride bicycle. All my siblings learned to ride bicycle from me, and all the neighborhood kids. So so there's this side of me which is getting this feedback from everybody. Hey, you're great.
You're getting the positive affirmation from the community. Also.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so when I applied for that IIT joint entrance exam, I didn't want to tell anybody because By the way, I should also tell you, being written off, being seen as a failure, it liberates you. Very quickly liberates you because you don't now have to prove anything to anybody. If you fail, that's what you're supposed to do.
So set the bar low. Lesson, set bar low.
Yeah.
Got it. Okay.
So but if you succeed, you surprise everybody, and that was the thing with me, and that's been the case most of my life.
And so you get to the U.S., you take these first set of jobs, you jump in, and you're learning the system. But you're kind of getting put through the proverbial rapids here. You get laid off multiple times, you get these things. what was the moment for you that realized that you need to get out of the regular flow, the regular process of just job after job, the safety net of jobs, and go to a much more aggressive, high-risk model of living?
Yeah, but that came a little bit later, right? Yeah, after third layoff, you really start to believe it's you. Because none of my friends was being laid off at the time. But part of the story is there is also I had a job from IBM, offer from IBM that I had turned down as first job. IBM was 70 to 80% of the industry, computer industry. It was IBM and Snow White and Seven Dwarfs. That was the Honeywell, Univac, GE, all those guys. So I knew I had screwed up when I turned IBM down without sufficient reason. And when I reapplied, the IBM even back then had computers. They said he turned us down without a reason. And so they sent me a letter. I still have that letter saved. I'm disqualified for life for a job at IBM.
Yeah. You got blacklisted.
Blacklisted by IBM, right?
Yeah.
So I knew part of it was my own fault. But industry was consolidating. Once I started to realize my mini computer industry was consolidating, and that's where I was. 40 companies going down to about 3. 37 companies shut down during that period. And so, but again, as luck would have it, after my third layoff, I'm looking around for a job, and this place called Santa Clara Valley, the Valley of Heart's Delight. Back then, that used to be a sign on the road, and it had jobs, and it's 3,000 miles away, and so I got married. Meanwhile, I and Ann drove out here. For the first 2, 3, 4 years, I was looking for safety. We had newly married, and pretty soon we had our daughter, Rajan. But I was not into safety for very long. Then I started to think through. I realized very quickly jobs are never sure thing. Jobs are never sure thing. You're putting your destiny in somebody else's hand. Now they will employ you or keep you as long as they need you. Mm-hmm. And then I said, flip should be true also. You shouldn't worry about them. And very quickly decided loyalty is not a thing for me. I'm not going to be loyal to myself and my family. That's it. And so it was mid-70s, 74, 75, 76. I was starting to feel, I need to, I know I have a job. I'm somewhat more secure than before, but it's a matter of time. Mm-hmm. And so by 75, 76, I was starting to think through, and my reaction was very quickly, well, I'm a hardware engineer, specialized. Another thing I realized very quickly, when you specialize and your specialty is in, you're doing really well. Mm-hmm. But it turn off the technology and your specialty is out. A lot of people will discover that now with AI, right? That all of a sudden, your high-paying job disappears. And it's not secure anymore. So I started to take courses in software, courses in business, courses in law. For 6 years, I went to Santa Clara and Stanford to diversify myself. And by late 70s, I thought I could do anything.
Yeah, I think one of the things that is really a clear theme is your emphasis on living the model of being a lifelong learner. In the classes that you took, also self-improvement. You worked on your speech impediment. You learned all the you've had to learn a business effectively in those things. And I'd love to hear how you realize or how you think about in today's day and age for people that aspect of the need to be constantly reinventing yourselves, finding your weak spots, and building out your portfolio of things.
Yeah. So in this valley, you live on a shifting sand. It's always shifting, right? And hardware engineers used to be they ruled the roost in 70s. And then it was software guys, then it was networking guys. You tore down the list, it's always somebody else. So for me, it was awareness that specialization is not a thing to do. Once you are specialized, you're going down this narrow path, and your options are going to be limited. How do you open it up? And of course, I am a curious person. My real passion is economics. Mm-hmm. and I would study the books, but economics doesn't pay the bills, right? So it wasn't till later in life, when I started to really devote time on economics, and I'm still on the board of the Stanford Institute of Economic Policy Research. I started to really read and engage with them, and I've been there for 25 years. And then I discovered my real passion is geopolitics.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're going to get to that. So you hold on to geopolitics.
So I haven't stopped learning. I spend more time. I've been getting foreign affairs magazine for about 35 years now. Mm-hmm. And I could write many of those articles.
Yeah. Well, let's before we go to that area, I want to continue on the journey, specifically your journey into becoming CEO. Because it's one of these ones that I got to witness firsthand through my father also, was, if you looked like us, you couldn't be a CEO back then. And I remember I've talked to VCs who were around the table back when you were, really starting your company, and they reaffirmed to me that the people around the table, in the investment committee, et cetera, the risk was that an engineer could not lead the company, so you had to go get a white male to actually be your CEO. So maybe talk to us a little bit about that journey from literal napkin to the moments when you actually realized that you had to be CEO and not somebody just different inside the company.
Yeah. Well, so even in my own startup, I was not the CEO to start with, right? There were three of us. Even
though it was your idea.
My idea, my thing, everything was me. Dr. Inder Mohan Singh, was very polished. He went to Doon School. Doon School is like the number one school in India. That's where Rajiv Gandhi went, and that's where all the Maharajas, their children too. He was very polished, and so I was the hardware wizard. So I was going to do the hardware design, and Naveen Jain, Dr. Naveen Jain, he was a PhD in computer science from CMU. He was going to do software. So you are the CEO. You don't raise the money. And presented himself well, and he also impressed us that he could do sales and marketing. So he became the CEO. But to make a long story short, when we went looking for money, we had tough time raising money, very tough time raising money. 100 no's from VCs, and eventually one baby. John Bosch, John Bosch passed away. And he used to brag that he discovered the Indians in the valley. John Bosch, looked at the plan. He said, very impressive plan. And he says, but where's the business guy in the team? And one more. Where's the business guy in the team? He says, we had the product done. We had paying customers. When this discussion is happening, and so, and he says, you guys been able to sell to somebody, been able to collect money, stuff works, and he says, have Indians been funded before? No, sir, not really. He says, why not? we don't know. He says, maybe it's time to do one. John Bosch said, maybe it's time to do one. He says, I don't want any sass from you guys. I'll make you one offer, and I want an answer in 15 minutes. And he says, $2 million for half the company. We didn't need 15 minutes. We didn't need 15 seconds. We said, yes, sir, we'll do it. And Inder was nudging me, says, hey, no, we should negotiate. No. There's nothing to negotiate with you. So we took the offer. And I just wanted a chance. to be able to do it. I didn't give a damn about valuation or how much I owned. I just wanted to have a chance to do it. And John Bosch offered us that chance. So, there was a lucky break because John Bosch thought it was time to do one.
Mm-hmm. But then this, then your CEO is pushed out.
Yeah.
He didn't do a very good job. And then you were clearly the right choice, but they still wanted to bring in...
No, they didn't think I was the right choice. They had no choice left. They pushed out, and they pushed out, and he said...
Classic VC moment. Wait, who's left?
Yeah, who's left?
Oh, that guy.
He said, Hey, you mind the place and don't spend any money.
Yeah.
While we don't find a CEO. And by the way, no more money for you guys.
Yeah.
So he walks out, and now I have the place. And he's made it very clear that no more money. And I looked around, I said, we have enough cash for 7-8 months, and by the time they find somebody, we'll be dead. So, I said, then I felt very liberated. I said, here's my chance to do, what I think needs to be done. I turned the place upside down. The first week I took over, I laid off 1/3 of the company to extend the runway. Mm-hmm. And there's somebody here in the audience. He drove 200 miles from Pismo Beach, for this event. Who was there at Athlon in those days, and Sean. I'll introduce him at the end. So it was a moment, man meets the moment type of situation, right? And within 3 months, I had the place humming. And within 4 or 5 months, 6 months, money was starting to flow in, and we were profitable in 6 months. And all of a sudden, these people come running back. What happened here? What happened here? So now the story changes. This is we are doing really well. We are growing nicely. We are profitable. Hey, this company should go public. Yeah, I think we are in that shape. We need to get a CEO. Mm-hmm. Because we now need to get a CEO because this company needs to go public. And, so even though I was doing really well, they still didn't see me as a CEO material, right? Mm-hmm. We did hire a CEO. But I think the Valley has gotten over that. There used to be a thinking here. Entrepreneur starts, and then we take this general manager from a division of HP or IBM, and somehow transplant him there. And while we have a well-functioning company with a good-looking CEO, that tried about maybe 50 times and probably failed about 49 times out of those 50 times.
Yeah. Well, just to comment on that, obviously we've seen incredible success in the community, the number of CEOs, Indian CEOs that have been out there, both male and female, just incredible. But at the same time, we've seen some incredible severe racism right now about Indians being in leadership roles and some strong populist backlash. Yeah. And I'm wondering, given your interests on economics and global affairs, what's your how do you think about this moment where we're actually a target?
So when we arrived, your dad probably will remember, America was openly racist. What you see right now is nothing. Racist jokes were, fine in the company. The Indians were called CJs, Tamil Jatis. Mm-hmm. And hey, walking down the street, hey CJ, that would be a common way people will address you. I think what's happening now is a little bit of jealousy. Mm-hmm. A little bit of jealousy, because and that's one of the things I explain in the book. Because I met somebody. He says, "You guys cheat." I said, "How can you cheat your way to become a CEO of Microsoft or IBM or Google?" You can tell how dumb that thought is, right? How do you cheat to become a successful entrepreneur? Mm-hmm. So I think there's a little bit of jealousy, but I think that this shall pass too. America has a land of immigrants, has always had this love-hate relationship with immigrants, always. Benjamin Franklin didn't like Germans. in Pennsylvania colony. They had smelly food. They spoke funny language. He used to be openly, say about, hey, we don't need Germans here. Irish Americans, in the 1850s, you can go back to the list. Jews, you think Jews who are white, why are they still an issue? They serve a amount of jealousy. But America's dependence upon Indian talent is fairly absolute.
Yeah.
It's fairly absolute. If all the Indians were to leave America, there was a movie, A Day Without Mexicans. But if A Day Without Indians in America, would be a bit terrible. We saved the world during the Y2K.
I'm not even touching that one. So I just want to, if you've got questions, make sure to write them down, especially those also online. Give it in your chat. People are going to come around and collect them and bring them up here in a few minutes for the first batch. I want to shift gears a little bit into your taking and being one of the early people who really broke through and sort of said like a new approach to life, to entrepreneurship is possible. You also recognize that there was a lot of people that you could help, and there was a shift for you fundamentally in the creation of TIE to say, hey, we should do something for the community. And the question I really have here is, and you actually quote my dad on this, which is, you say it shouldn't be this hard for the next generation. But what I'm really curious about, as you talk about TIE, is that moment that you collectively decided to move from I to we, and decided, and what does that teach us in this moment in time about us as a community and cohesive, when I say community, I mean America, about taking care of the next generation.
So let me give you, this is most of the Indians will understand, Americans will sort of appreciate this perspective. We left India behind. I was here, 27 years before I went back to India for anything other than family reasons. And for all practical purposes, I was American. I'm married here. I am doing everything. But one thing, became very clear. You can become American, all American you want, but every time you walk into a room, the first thing they ask you is, "Where are you from?" Where are you really from, right? So you never are truly American.
Yeah, I remember being asked, people asking me as a kid, "You have an incredibly good accent." Remember I said, "Yeah, it's California."
Yeah. So when we succeeded, beyond our wildest dreams, Vash, and me and a few others, and we started to talk to each other, and we all had similar experiences. A lonely journey, nobody believed in us, nobody was there to talk to or mentor us. And I said in the book, shouldn't have been that lonely. But India started to change in 91. Went from being socialist, to become open market economy. And all of a sudden, we are starting to dream. Recession went like this. We got independence in 1947, but we are still beggars and Germans. We still stuck in the mud. Is this our opportunity, to do something? And we are talking about entrepreneurship as a freedom movement. It was really thorny discussions. All of a sudden, hey, we have to inspire our people to become entrepreneurs. We have to help them. We have to become their mentors. So we are talking at this lofty level, and a discussion went from being hard-nosed, cutthroat entrepreneurs to spiritual way of thinking. How do we transform the environment around us? And for me, somehow I got pulled in, because all of a sudden, I'm thinking, my childhood, I'm thinking about how far I have come, and I was thinking about hey, how many people are there like me? Can I reach back to them? This whole Thai experiment was a very, very spiritual experiment from for me, and still is when I go to India and I talk to people, and on this trip last month, in India, people still remembered me from 25 years ago. Everywhere I went, I had been sort of disengaged, from India for about maybe 15 years because of family reasons. But all of a sudden, so this thing has become. I thought about the entrepreneurship as a new freedom movement for India. How do we get rid of poverty? How do we create wealth on a mass scale?
Yeah, you actually specifically say in the book that wealth comes from entrepreneurship. And so you've advocated that you'd like to see 10 million entrepreneurs in India when it celebrates 100 years.
I stole that from your dad. He used to talk about the only source of new wealth is entrepreneurship. Mm-hmm. In a society, which doesn't have the natural resources, like oil and all that, right? Saudi Arabia, and we have plenty of brains. Can we make them more entrepreneurial? And so, so when we came to America, the brand of India was very straightforward: a land of snake charmers and a land of beggars. Mm-hmm. People were pretty open about that one. I don't think anybody talks about land of snake charmers and land of beggars anymore. India is very much seen as a powerful, entrepreneurial, technology-savvy country, right? And so now you can see a small amount of entrepreneurship is having this level of impact. Can we, scale it up? 10 million entrepreneurs. So this trip, my message everywhere in India, everywhere I went, and I went to a lot of places, was same thing. Can we have 10 million entrepreneurs by the time India turns 100 years in 1947? And if that happens, watch out. Watch out.
So let's return back to then Thai, because I still want to get back to this portion of this interesting moment, because you could have just said, hey, look, we're going to retire. We're just going to go to philanthropy. We're going to do something else. You could have gone that approach, but instead, you and the community decided to work even harder by, you set up Thai, but you all really put your entire spiritual body behind this, all your energy into this. And so I'd like to understand is why, and what do we need to see out of the future generations to double down on that level of giving?
So I was only 42 when the company went public in 1987. And I was only 50 when I left Nobel in not quite 50, 49 years old when I left Nobel. So the obvious thing to do was do the next startup. This time, I am much more seasoned, much more experienced person, and that's what I thought I will do. Mm-hmm. But like I mentioned earlier, I got pulled in. This wasn't an effort I went after. I got pulled in. Again, the group, the initial group, AJ is here, Swash is here, Rai Prasad is here. There was this group, which was very much fun to be with. We started, nonsense as this, we don't change the world type of thing, right? And and while this is happening, I'm also mentoring younger people. So here, there's a story. After all these years of working, I'm home. I don't have a job, and my wife tells me after a few days, you're in my space during the day. Don't you have anything to do out there? Come back after 5 p.m.
Yeah.
And
you learned who the real CEO is.
And she was not used to having me at home during the day, right? And we had this office in Santa Clara, the Thai office, that we had this place rented, and we used to open that on the weekends. Saturday, Sunday, all of us will show up. Jashri and all these women will show up, and we'll do the Thai stuff. So I set up the office there. And I take my newspapers, my magazines, my laptop, and to Thai office. And the word starts to spread. Hey, you could drop in and have an hour of my time without anything. And I welcome the company. I'm sitting there reading my paper. Somebody says, "Oh, you got a minute?" Yeah, I got all day. What do you want? Mm-hmm. Yeah. And before I knew, I was mentoring people in large numbers. It got to the place where I hired an admin to schedule me at my own expense. Because so many incoming calls. And before I knew, I was investing in the companies because you have these entrepreneurs you mentor. You think they are very sharp, and you send them to VCs, and VCs say, no Indian entrepreneurs. So this investment part happened only because the VCs are still turning us down, and that kind of fired me up. Mm-hmm. After all we have done, after all we have proven, we are still not good, right? Mm-hmm. So each one, this is a feedback into me. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So one of the questions that came up on this dimension is most successful Indians seem to give back to India or Indian causes and not seen as contributing to local causes, particularly for the communities, here in the United States. Do you agree with that? And if so, what needs to change?
Well, I don't agree with that at all. We are here. This is our country. If you want to, so I have, as a rule, given, here
a lot,
as much as I have given in India. When I'm married here. My wife was from here. So she said, of course, IIT, you should do, but then you should give to Michigan Tech also. Mm-hmm. So we set up a school at IIT Bombay, and we paid for the building at the Michigan Tech.
In the Midwest.
Yeah, Midwest. By the way, I should tell you, Michigan Tech, I have been going there 2 to 3 times a year, to preach the gospel entrepreneurship for professors and students, and I have transformed the whole town. Mm-hmm. They think when I show up there, and there was a professor there who had wanted to do a startup in space, and he came to see me, and I and Rai Prasad and a few other gave him the seed money, $1.5 million 10 years ago, and that company Orbion has transformed the whole small town of Horton, and so this notion of that you should only give to India it will get the reaction back from people that you're getting, right? Mm-hmm. If you love it so much over there, why are you here? You have to be able to. India is a noble experiment. I see India as a very noble, and I'll give you my reason for that one. But U.S. has been also a noble experiment for a very long time. And U.S. welcomed us with open arms, even though I told you it was very racist, it was very welcoming to us. Mm-hmm. And we'll see what happens. So let me give you about India. India is the only country, which became a democracy from the get-go. It had a very peaceful freedom movement. Very under Mahatma Gandhi. Country was 90% illiterate, 90% below poverty. Massively diverse country. Poor, illiterate, diverse, but they chose to become a democracy from the day one. No other country in the world has done that. With the universal franchise, America became free, only landed. White men could vote. When you look at the Europe, they looted the world, but they were liberal at home. So India now is emerging on the other end. Finally, starting to happen. So it's a very noble experiment for the world to watch. That diversified land, more diversified than Europe. Europe can only dream of becoming India. Europe, after about 50 years of common market, EU now, before was a coal and steel community, still are 27 different countries.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's true. Absolutely, the ability to transform itself. That actually leads me to, and tied through a few of these questions are what I might call some of these quick hits, is this clarity of thought that you have really comes through in the book. It's always been there from my experiences with you. And one of the things that I think is in there that I thought was really helpful is that you have a daily memo process that you use. And I think it would be really interesting to hear what that is, how you use it to get clarity of thought.
Yeah. So we didn't have any mentors, right? And we didn't have anybody to talk to, so I talked to myself. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I'm going to do this thing, and then I will sit down. Why do I think I should do that? And then I will write. I might be. I will critique my thinking, and I'll do that. So I will always have this running paper on anything I did, any project, anything. And I still have some of these saved. And if you are really a favorite entrepreneur of mine, I let you see that book, because this is what you should be doing to mentor yourself, to keep yourself honest. And I found that to be very useful, very useful. And as soon as I realized I made a mistake, I drove back and amended that paper, and now I have a new working paper with me. All right. So this memo.
You have like a Kanwal playbook.
Yeah, Kanwal playbook
kind of thing.
Yeah. So the people who work for me, the senior, my direct reports, I will have them critique my papers to make sure this is the way I'm thinking, this is the way I intend to do. You tell me what's wrong with my thinking, and I'll interpret your way of thinking, and that's our operating plan. And I found that to be very useful, because everybody who worked for me had no doubt whatsoever what I wanted done. Mm-hmm. I never had to tell anybody what to do as a result. This is what we are doing. This is I'm thinking. I will interpret your critique if you improve upon this thing. But otherwise, we are doing this thing, right? And that was one part. The other part of this thing, I don't know if I mentioned that in the book. I used to be, still is very hard prioritizer. Very hard prioritizer. You cannot do everything you want to do. So I will come back and say, what is the number one thing that I must do before anything else? And if I have more time, what will be number two things I will do if I have some time left? And maybe if I have more time left, number three, but no more than three. And I will have that this week, this month, today.
Wow.
And so I will have that on a whiteboard outside my office. These are my priorities for this month, for this week, and these days. If it's not on the list, don't bother.
Well, this gets to one of your another question, which is you've got these priorities for the company. They are always all-consuming. You've got the community, all that consuming. With entrepreneurship is so consuming and full of sacrifices. Is there anything that you would do differently with respect to kids and family, or how do you put kids and family into that prioritization mix?
No, kids and families were always number one priority. Always number one priority. If you ask me, besides work, so my kids will tell you, and my nephews and nieces will tell you, my priorities have always been for them: education, health, family, and nothing else matters. I have never ever ignored the trial of the family. So my deal with my wife was, you are the CEO at home, I am CEO out there. And I'm going to do a bit things work for all of us. But if you ever need me, let me know, and I'll come run in. But don't tell me for frivolous things. You have full freedom to run the household. Any which way you want. Because we are a team. And that thing worked very well for her. That worked very, very well for me. For the kids, when I would travel, I had a fax machine. If you need help with the math, fax me, and I'll work with you on the thing. So I don't think any of my family members felt ignored ever. Mm-hmm.
Well, reading the book, it comes through very clearly how proud of how proud you are of your family, and as somebody else had pointed out in one of these comments, is that the book really reads like a love story. which I think is something special and unique to accomplish. I've been fortunate enough to be around you and Anne and see that love firsthand. And I want to hold some space for you to talk about her. And you're very open about some of the issues that also took place.
Okay.
And I'd love to hold that space for you.
Yeah. So, as I tell in the book, I was a person, with speech impairment. My father always, putting me down. As a result, I had a pretty low self-esteem. And during my IIT days, I was a backbencher, keeping quiet, but I'm competing on the where it mattered in the math and the things, so I held my own there. So we have, Anne and I were pen pals, so we meet. She's, if these photos are there in the book, she's one of the most beautiful girls I ever met. In my life, and it was sort of,
and a military woman and military brat.
Yeah, and she first time we met, she had the military uniform on, with a sergeant, chevron stripes, and I was smitten, right? So I finally, when we are going to part, after the first visit, I mustered enough courage, to pop the question, and. I fully expected a firm no, and but I said I had to do it. If I didn't do it, I will never know. And she didn't say no, but she didn't say yes. She says, we just met, and but I got a yes. I didn't get a no, so that was good enough. And
you were a risk taker back then.
So that yes was transformed me as an individual. I can win. The woman of my dream, the girl of like that. There's nothing wrong with me. Mm-hmm. So that thing lasted lifetime. By the way, this week, next Wednesday, she would have been gone 1 year, and it's hard to believe it's been 1 year, but we were married 54 years, and it'll be 55 years in another 3 weeks from now, 26th of March. So Anne grew up in a very dysfunctional household. Our mother, grandmother, great-grandmother were all divorced. After about 20 years of marriage, she fully expected to be divorced. In 20 years of marriage, that was the norm for her. Both parents were alcoholic. So she was one of those adult child of alcoholic parents. 7-year-old, she's minding the whole house. Her brother, her sister, her parents, she will take care of the household. Very responsible person. But it takes toll, and we were married, maybe 15, 16 years, she started to have this anxiety attacks. And they were normally tied to, me getting a promotion, me getting a raise, me doing something really well. All of a sudden, here comes the nets, she was about to drop, he's going to leave me. There was nothing I could say or do, will convince her. And it takes over here. So she started to have anxiety attacks and depression. You went to, in the beginning I would get really upset, Hey, what's the matter? We are doing well. We have healthy kids. We are making funny, well. But then after a while, I realized, she's not something she's doing on purpose. And I started to educate myself, and started to understand the depression. It takes over. Depression takes over your whole system. And she tried to commit suicide. And eventually, that's your life. I still love her. She still loves me. There's no issues there. Kids are healthy. So you try to sort of not tell people, right? But eventually, that implies that you're ashamed of it. I'm not ashamed of anything about her. She was as wonderful a person as you can imagine, but she ended up not able to fight her demons from the childhood. Her brother her brother is only 3 years younger than her. She was 75 and brother 72. And that relationship was frozen 68 years ago when Mart was 4 and she was 7. And she would say Mart, and Mart will hop to it right away. Because Mart's life was sort of managed by her, because without her, Mart would have gone hungry, sleeping. So I looked at the whole thing, and I felt pretty sad that Anne should have been enjoying life. We finally have made it, but there was nothing I could do.
Yeah, well, she leaves. She leaves an incredible mark on the community. She's an incredible force of a person, a really a very special person. And I want to also thank you for putting the issues out in front and center, because it's one of these things that it's like, as much as I think we talk about entrepreneurship and all of these other things, it's remarkable that we will have certain issues as a stigma in not only our society but inside the community.
Well, the Indians especially brush these things under the rug, but it's only done. It's also done in America too, by and large, right? Depression. I'll tell you, almost no help is available. When somebody commits suicide, there's almost no help. We tried everything. We tried every agency, hospitals. El Camino Hospital had a program, and they wouldn't accept her as a patient. There's a place in Houston called Managers. Somebody had his mother commit suicide 100 years ago. He set that place up. It's a wonderful place to get the help, but it's super, super expensive. Mm-hmm. Ordinary people couldn't afford it. $2,000 a day. It's not covered by health insurance, not covered by anything, right? But we could afford it. So she spent several months there, mm-hmm. and she was in much better shape. But she was never. When I first met her, she was very bubbly, very spunky, fun person. Towards the end, she was sort of making things are happening, but she's not enjoying the life, like I thought she should have been.
Yeah. Well, I want to switch gears from that. Thank you for sharing that. I know it takes a lot, especially as we're so close to anniversary. The part I wanted to switch to, which is a theme through so many of the questions, is artificial intelligence, AI. And, what it is, clearly a lot of angst as people are talking about it. We were talking about it a bit backstage. It's hard not to watch the news and not see it. And so I'd love to hear your commentary, because you're talking to entrepreneurs every day. You're investing. You're thinking about these technologies. How are you thinking about AI as in this moment in time?
Well, AI is a wonderful productivity enhancing tool, but it's coming after white-collar jobs. Up to now, the productivity enhancement has gone after blue-collar jobs by and large. Automation, manufacturing disappeared and all that. But think about it. A person in his 40s, 50s, smart engineer, software guy, gets laid off because his job can be done by AI. What's going to happen to him? He's not. He still has a mortgage to pay. He still has children to educate. He still has a life to go on. So he's going to go through this process. And I'll give you a couple of examples of this. How this thing happens. He's going to go through this thing. Curse a few times, but next day he's going to say, "Hey, I gotta, do something," and you'll see an entrepreneurial boom as a result. People say the same thing. I'm not going to let anybody or anything lay me off ever again, like I did about 40, 50 years ago. And when IBM got in trouble in late 80s, early 90s, because mainframes, were in trouble because the PCs and servers and were starting to take over. There was this thing that IBM will lay off people in thousands, and which they did. and the Hudson Valley will be in big trouble. Hudson Valley, New York, in big trouble because that's where the IBM was. And I kept saying, no. All these guys will get laid off, and many of them will emerge as entrepreneurs. And Hudson Valley will really blossom, and that's what happened. That's what happened. Nobody ever heard of the depression in the Hudson Valley. I think the productivity enhancing tools knocks people out of their comfort zones. Getting knocked out of comfort zone is a very good thing to happen to you. Otherwise, you're busy here today, this project, this delivery, this deadline, and the time is wasting, right? And pretty soon you're old. So when somebody knocks you out of your comfort zone, you're liberated now to think, and you go through this, various feelings, and eventually say, hey, times that bad, and I can't be worried about this too long. So my sense is that this AI boom, AI-induced entrepreneurial boom is about to happen.
Mm-hmm. What's the advice that you are giving to new college graduates?
New college graduates,
they're about to enter this new era of hyper rapid change.
Yeah. So I have always given same advice: don't specialize. Mm-hmm. Don't specialize. Your specialty is in favor. You do well. 2 years ago, if you are a computer science graduate, you could name your salary. Last year, 300,000 computer science graduates could not get a job.
What does not specialize mean? Does that mean go to liberal arts school?
No. Not specialized.
Wow, I know somebody's going to be tweeting at me later on this one.
Not specialized means you don't become narrowly focused.
Okay.
Technology, you keep your focus broad. Accept and adopt the change sooner than later. You don't put off. AI is happening. Don't put your head in the sand. Learn the AI. How can I use AI? Learn to use the technology as a friend rather than as an enemy. So
embrace. You're in the bucket of embrace. Are you worried about anything?
No, I am not worried at all.
You're all gas, no brakes.
Yeah.
Is that accurate?
Well, you always. I am not into what I would call the emptiness. We talked about self-learner. I am always learning. Mm-hmm. Just imagine, the world that you live in is ever changing, forever changing. There is technology is moving at a breakneck speed. You cannot hold on to things, and say, hey, wait for me. You have to run either with that, Ray Noda, my boss at Novell used to say, 3 types of people out there. People, who fight change. They are brushed aside, the tide of change, will not stop for anybody. People who adapt to change, they survive and they become good employees. And people who cause change, they are the entrepreneurs. They are the ones who are making waves. So they are ahead of the change. I think what is happening, and this process has been going on forever. The economies of scale, that drove the early part of industrial revolutions, is not necessary anymore. You can do a virtual corporation, one-man corporation, out of your garage, outsource the manufacturing to China, outsource the coding to India, find a CFO in a box. Where everybody is going to go back to become an entrepreneur, just like they were in 19th century. Everybody was an entrepreneur. The corporation, as we know, is not that old, right? 150 years old when you go back. So you're going back to where everybody's going to be an entrepreneur, working for himself. Why should anybody have?
So everyone should really just embrace entrepreneurship.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Since we only have a few minutes left, I want to squeeze in a little bit more in here. There's something that I found really fascinating is that, and I see this through your LinkedIn post. For those of you that people out there that don't follow you on LinkedIn, they really should, because you're providing a lot of wisdom these days. And the way I think of this, I'd love for you to do is, if you think of people in each decade of their life, what's the advice that you would give them? So let's start with what's the advice you would give to people in their 20s and then move on to 30s and so on. So let's just, we'll rapid fire this. 20s.
Yeah, 20s, learn as much as you can. Look around, don't rush into anything. Don't, put any stakes in the ground. Stay, hang loose.
Okay. And go with the winds.
Go with the wind. Test.
Try out stuff.
Test.
Okay. 30s.
Well, 30s, you start to, and now have a few notches on your you're done by now, right? Tried few things. I'm talking about startups, and maybe you would have succeeded by that time, but you have tried several of them.
So you've tried out different things.
Yeah.
Are you specializing in your 30s?
No, I never want to specialize.
Never specializing.
Never.
Okay.
CEOs are not specialists.
Okay.
Yeah. The people who do PhDs. Sorry, they become professors by and large. The people who don't do PhDs, they become CEOs.
Some of us figure out both.
Some of us, there's exception to that's the other rule. There's exception to every rule.
Yeah.
There is no hard and fast rule which applies. But generally speaking, you need to be a general athlete.
Yeah.
You have to be able to do multiple different things well.
40s.
40s, now you have this constraint. You have children who are teenagers who need to be educated. You have to become a little bit more practical for a while.
50s.
50s, you get liberated and your kids are out of house. Now you are seasoned, but still have your strength and youth and time to do another startup. Ray Nora did a startup at 56. I can give you a lot of names. The age between 38 and 55 is they need to be practical. But after 50 to 55, you're back to being free-spirited again.
Okay. 50s, 50-year-olds, get on it. 60s.
Start mentoring people. Start betting on younger guys. And benefit from their success.
70s onward.
Yeah. Oh, geez, 70. 70s was one of the most wonderful decade for me here, and. I just turned 80 a few months ago. I don't know. I think we are 60s now. See, you have learned a lot in life. 40, 50 years of learning. If you can impart some of that knowledge, some of that thing, to a youngster and improve his arts of success as an entrepreneur, he gains a lot. You haven't lost a thing. And maybe you can bet on him a little bit too, so you can start to benefit. So 70s, 80s. I don't know what I'm going to do in 80s. I'm busy right now figuring out what to do.
Okay. In our remaining 2 minutes here, you spent time with presidents, prime ministers. If you had 5 minutes now with the president, the other world leaders, talking in front of the United Nations, what would you tell them? I am a one-trick pony.
Can we create wealth together? Can we all become entrepreneurs, please? I went to Pakistan. Met with General Musharraf. Gave them the same message that I gave to the Prime Minister of India. And by the way, gave them the same message about the telecom policy. It can be focused on creating some wealth so we can all live happily ever after, rather than fight over who gets what. Let's enlarge the pie. I don't know. The reason people fight is because there's not enough to go around, right?
If there's something that was the baton, if we think of the baton that is proverbially passed from one generation to the next, what is that baton that you want people to see? And not just, you can't just say entrepreneurship.
No.
What is the nature of that baton that you want people to say?
Well, I don't know. I haven't. It's not in the book, right? So I would have put that in the book. I think.
Now you know what it was like growing up with you.
Yeah, I think the message I tell people, you can do everything right. You can do everything right, and you should try to, but you still need this Lady Luck. Lady Luck has to still smile at you, and and by the way, when Lady Luck does come knocking at your door, you better be home.
Yeah. To the Louis Pasteur quote, the luck favors a prepared mind.
Yeah. So I think you have to prepare. You have to prepare yourself and hope for the best. And but you cannot just be empty dreamer. You cannot be empty dreamer. And Chet Chili, I don't know if you heard the word Chet Chili. Chet Chili, is the Indian folklore about this dreamer who's always dreaming big, but he's non-doer.
Yeah. Well, I think that's, unfortunately, we're out of time on that. Our thanks to Kunwal Rekhi, author of Groundbreaker, Risk, Rewards, and Lessons from a Legendary Entrepreneur. If you think we covered a lot of ground, that is nothing compared to what is in the book. We encourage you to pick up a copy of Kunwal's book here or at a local bookstore. And a reminder, please consider becoming a member of the Commonwealth Club World Affairs to get more great programming like you just saw here. If you've enjoyed this program, I'll be next interviewing Maya Shankar, who started the Behavioral and Social Sciences team at the White House, here back on stage on April 8th about her new and inspiring book. For more information about the Commonwealth Club World Affairs membership or any upcoming programs, please visit www.commonwealthclub.org or talk to any of the great volunteers that are here today. I'm DJ Patil. Thank you. Be safe, be happy, be bold, be an entrepreneur. Thank you, Kunwal.
Thank you.